Welcome to the show, Jeff Salzman.
Good to be here, Jason. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, really grateful to get a little time with you. Good to see you again.
Likewise.
Yeah. Um, Jeff, I just introduced you kind of in a formal way. I'm curious how you introduce yourself. What would you say in a minute or two about you? What are you up to in the world?
Wow. Well, what I am professionally, if you will, is I am a teacher of integral theory. And I have been doing the podcast called The Daily Evolver for the last 12 years. And it's a podcast where I look at current events through the lens of integral theory. So the lens of the idea that culture and consciousness are evolving and have evolved and will continue to evolve. So that's the lens on which I look at the current events. So it helps explain current events. And then, of course, current events helps explain integral theory. So, that's
Yeah.
what I do professionally. I worked in the integral movement for 20 years, part of the Integral Institute, founded the Boulder Integral Center, have had, endless seminars and conferences and all of that good stuff. And now I actually have to say, I enjoy working through Zoom, where I don't have to leave the house or even get dressed from the waist down. I don't want to.
Dude, totally. I love Zoom. I'm so grateful for the fact that I get even more time with my family,
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, again, so good to have you here. We're going to dive into some of these topics: society, integral theory, culture, relationships, relationship development. But I'm also curious, just by way of getting to know you a little bit, and for the listener to orient toward you. Married, kids, no kids, single, divorced.
I'm gay. I've had three long-term relationships, and I'm in my third, moving into year 11, and very happy with my Chuck.
Okay, that's so cool.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, long-term partnership's quite the transformational path, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And it's wonderful to be in one where we're on the same team. I mean, I've actually had good relationships, I have to say.
That's
but
cool.
This one has a depth, and it's like we read your book, Jason.
Right on. Cool.
I mean, we're working it all the time. It's really good.
Yeah. What would you say, just to hang out here for a minute on your relationship, what would you say is the thing, if there was one thing, I know there's many things, but if there was one thing that makes your relationship work and be healthy and strong, what would you say that thing is?
Yeah, well, I think what I learned on my third relationship is that I need to stop the improve my partner project.
Oh, yeah.
I need to retire that project. Yeah, it is, actually. And I think what I'm getting right with Chuck and he with me is that we love each other, and we love who we are together. And we see each other both as growing, evolving individuals. So there's a next Chuck, there's a next Jeff, there's a next us. And it's not anything particularly fancy. In some ways, it's just more comfortable and more warm. I mean, that kind of thing is of course, great progress.
Yeah.
And so, that's what we're doing. And I just feel grateful for the opportunity to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. What was it, I'm curious, that had you set down the habit that many of us have to improve our partner project? Like, was there something that happened? Was that in the previous relationship, and then Chuck came along and you didn't have to do that because you found a different kind of person? Or were you doing that to Chuck initially and then you somehow stopped doing that?
I think I was doing it with Chuck in the beginning as well. And he just mentioned it a couple times. And that's all it took for me, because I was ready to get that. And I was ready to see it. And I was ready to let it go. And so I think that's what happened here. And we both clicked into that pretty well. And I have to also say, and this is, this is a little unorthodox, but we live together 4 days a week and apart 3. He has his house across town.
Amazing.
And I gotta say, there is something to that where we
Yeah.
just get to have, a reset, and I'm happy to see him come, and I'm happy to see him go.
It's so cool. Oh,
Yeah.
that's great. It is unorthodox, but I think more people could actually benefit from a scenario like that.
Yeah, me too.
Because there's so much pressure now and demand on a partnership about how we're all supposed to be everything to everyone here, to everything to our partner.
Totally.
And
Totally.
this notion of taking space for ourselves and just going away for 3 days is like, you can't do that. So anyway, thanks for modeling another
Yeah.
way. That's
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
How long?
It's
So
just,
you said for the last 4 years?
we're together now going on 11 years.
But when did you? How long ago did you institute that sort of schedule that you guys figured out that really worked for you?
Well, we were dating, I suppose, for the first year. So he was at his place, I was at mine. But
Right.
when there was a sense of we're together, and that was pretty quick, then that's when we started. And do we have exceptions occasionally if somebody's in town or this or that? But for the
Yeah.
most part, we really keep to it. And
Wow.
yeah, we both just really appreciate it and see that it's really, helps, makes it
Yeah.
easier. It really does.
Yeah. Super cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I could just keep going down this rabbit hole, but there's many questions I have for you, so we'll transition.
Yeah, cool.
What is integral theory for a new person, and how did you get into it?
Yeah, integral theory is a theory of the evolution of consciousness, and there's a lot of nerdy stuff to it, but the basic idea is that, well, evolution itself. I mean, that there's something going on here where 13.8 billion years ago, something came out of nothing and has complexified itself. Subatomic particles have complexified to create, the universe and ultimately us. And that there is a trajectory of the evolution, not just of the stuff, of the exterior of the planets and the biosphere and then us, but there's an internal evolution as well, an evolution of consciousness. And that we can see that in the evolution of the consciousness of a baby who grows into a magical child, and then a mythical child, and then maybe a scientific, and then moves into these worldviews come online sequentially. And they not only come online sequentially in terms of individuals, but they do in terms of the center of gravity of cultures. So, we started out in tribal cultures. Tribal cultures moved into empire cultures, which moved into big traditional cultures, which with a transcendent God and generally a king or queen or some emperor. And then the modern world. Now we have the postmodern world. And what we also have is we have, for the first time in history, in the last few hundred years, particularly in the leading edge, the developed world, we have many worldviews online at the same time. And so there's a lot of conflict between, these basic worldviews, which are very deep in our identity. And they're very hard to see outside of. And that's true for each of us individually, and it's true for cultures as a whole. And so seeing that and seeing that the whole system is alive and moving and growing, the growth is built into the system. There's a trajectory, there's a teleology there's something pulling it forward. And that's I think there's nothing that explains life and the world and the culture wars and politics and all of the stuff that we deal with, including interpersonal relationships, that does it better than that.
Yeah, than integral. How did you get into it? What was going on in your life at the time when you stumbled upon integral?
Well, I was always a seeker. I was a little religious little kid in Western Pennsylvania in my fundamentalist Christian church, and I would sing in the choir. And then I became an atheist early on, like 13, and then I went to college, and I knew I had to get out of Western Pennsylvania. And so I came to Boulder, Colorado. I hit the jackpot in the very first try, I have to say.
Yeah.
And so Boulder, of course, this is the late 70s, early 80s, is a hotbed, it still is, of, consciousness and culture and the human potential movement, and big Buddhist community here and Buddhist university here. And so, I just drank of many wells. I chased many rabbits,
Yeah.
as they say.
Yeah.
And, I have lots of friends doing the same thing. And, my friends would find teachers and gurus, and I never could find anybody who turned me on particularly. I was just, I was pretty flighty. I'm promiscuous, spiritually promiscuous.
Yeah.
And so I, did all these retreats and stuff. And then I walked into like a bookstore, I don't know, Walden's probably. And there on the table was a book called Up from Eden. And it was about the evolution of consciousness. And in that moment, when I just got this idea that humanity has come up from Eden, we haven't fallen from Eden. We're not fallen, we're growing. That it just made all the pieces fall into place. And that's what an integral theory does. Integral theory seeks to integrate the worldviews and basically all of human wisdom, science, spirituality, ancient, modern, spiritual, scientific, all of it, into just a bigger pattern, and see these patterns of movement through history. And that made sense to me. I received that as a spiritual revelation, actually.
Yeah.
It's not like I really considered it or thought my way into it, or, This is Ken Wilber book. And turns out that Ken lived 5 miles from me, a fact I did not know for many years, as I devoured his books and tried to find somebody to talk to. But eventually we connected, and I joined him in the Integral Institute when we were doing, these seminars that, have become iconic in a way. The integral spirituality and integral psychology and integral business. And it was a very, very powerful time. This was 2003, 2007.
Yeah.
And I started the Boulder Integral here in Boulder. We bought an old church and revamped it and did seminars there. And now I'm just doing my podcast because I'm semi-retired.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's so cool. And for the newbie listening, integral theory can get extremely heady, and we're not going to get too conceptual today. And at the same time, there's one frame in particular that I really like, besides the 4 quadrants, and that's this concept of levels and lines of development.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we could jump off just a short description of that, and I can start just with a super vague or super nebulous maybe description, and you can kind of fill it out more.
Yeah.
And then I want to talk just about what's going on in the world, maybe, and we can kind of plug that framework into the conversation. Is that okay?
Yes.
Cool. And of course, anything you want to add. So levels and lines, this is why I like integral theory, is because there's a distinction around lines of development and levels of development. So for example, a person in Boulder can be a meditator, a yogi kind of person, can be a deep spiritual person, but go home to their marriage and be a complete disaster, because that line of development it's at a lower stage, or it's just underdeveloped. It's like a weak muscle. If we look at integral as like the body, I have big biceps and my legs are small, or something like that. And that framework, I think, is incredibly useful in intimate relationships, because people get really stuck in their relational they don't develop relationally, and they start to use other things to try to make their relationship work. And I see it over and over again, and I'm like, man, if we just come back to human development, how a baby evolves into a child and then into an adult eventually, like Erickson's work, I think that's so useful. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about lines and levels of development.
Yeah, it's really key to the theory, and that is that human beings individually, and this is also true of individuals collectively. So families, groups, and cultures. And nations.
Yep.
Also, but let's look at it individually. That there are many ways of slicing and dicing one's lines of development, but a real simple one is that we develop cognitively, interpersonally, emotionally, physically, morally, and spiritually. So, these are these big categories, and they're just sort of intuitive to us.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, you can also actually slice and dice it so that you can talk about people who are developed in the line of parenting
Mm-hmm.
or culinary skills or a particular sport. So I always love what Ken Wilber said. He said, there are as many lines of development as things you can say about a human being.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
that's just one of the ways we can look at it. But
Yeah.
in terms of just these big categories, people develop remarkably independently in one line or the other. So you can have people who are at a high cognitive level, but a low moral level. This would be like the Nazi doctors, classic example kind of thing. You can have people who are interpersonally just off the charts, these people who just have this natural warmth and they just know what to do. They have a wisdom about other people. They love exploring and they're curious about other people. And that's just their specialty.
Yeah.
They're just really good at it. They may not be particularly cognitively developed. They may not be spiritually developed or even emotionally developed in some cases. So these things are independent. And that's hard to wrap your head around in a way, because you run into people, and this is, you mentioned this, this was a trap of a lot of these spiritual teachers who, they have powerful spiritual realizations off the charts. I mean, they're real. They're not, they're real. They see oneness, they got the whole thing, but they are morally, they're having sex with their students, they're taking their students' money, they're bullying, they're just not there in terms of other levels of development. In some cases, they're not particularly cognitively developed. You don't really need to be. You don't need to be any of these things. And one of the things that integral theory, this is just a foundational principle of integral theory, is that everybody gets to be who they are.
Yeah.
And we want them to be the healthiest expression of who they are. And that's our only job. It's like shining light on a rose. You count on it to bloom on its own. And so that's the basic sort of principle. So then when you have this view of yourself and other people, first of all, it's a more complex and complete view of yourself. It's a more inclusive view of yourself.
Yeah.
Instead of, why am I so stupid? Why did I do that? A lot of the self-flagellation that comes from thinking, I should be better than that. You just get a little more real. And you get more real with other people, not in a way of condemning or even criticizing necessarily, but in a way of just getting curious.
Yeah.
Because we're all, I always love that. What's that one? God don't make junk, or whatever it is. Everybody actually is here on a sacred karmic journey, and they get to be who they are. And we get to be in relationship with them, and we get to be curious about them, and we get to love them, and and then we get into all of the stuff that you talk about in your book so beautifully, I have to say, Jason, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
I mean, talk about, really blowing this whole thing up in a way where you just see so much more. And that's what integral theory does. It just lets you see more of reality.
Totally. And I have a question for you here on, because you're talking about these different almost parts of ourselves, like the cognitive, the emotional, the interpersonal. What's interesting is I'm just in this moment, I'm thinking about values, and I work a lot with people around their values. So for example, if I value relationships and I truly value my wife, let's say, it's a high value, more so than landscaping my yard, although that's a value of mine. And so I'm going to put way more money, time, and energy into that high value, right? So I'm going to be more developed there, you could say, interpersonally, because it's a high value. So is some of this like people who judge themselves as stupid, for example, or not smart? Is it because they just haven't applied themselves because it's been a low value over time?
Yeah,
is that sort of, I'm just curious how you would weave in values to this.
No, that's a very, very interesting question, Jason. And, this is something that Ken Wilber would talk about, and developmentalists in general, is that nobody knows why some people develop more in one line of development than other people, or why some people are more highly developed in general than other people. We tend to rise to the center of gravity of the culture that we grow up in. Sometimes people exceed it. Sometimes people, like now we have our modern world in the United States. We have traditionalists. We have postmodernists. These are people who, they're where they are, where it's interesting to them.
Mm-hmm.
And if something is, that's where the idea of you mentioned your landscape, you're a gardener, obviously,
Yeah,
and me too. And the idea is to give a plant what it needs to grow, and it'll do the growing on its own.
mm-hmm.
And everybody is being. That's the other piece of this, is that there's a procreant urge, is what Walt Whitman called it. But it's this idea of emergence that is happening. You have a 13-year-old son, you said, right?
Yeah.
You just can't stop him from being 14. It's not a matter of making good choices or bad choices. He's going to become 14. And it's just, there's this growth that happens. It happens to all of us. And the cool thing about Integral is we have permission to assume that it happens in adulthood. Mm-hmm. And it continues to happen. We don't just all become 21 or 25 and then it's over. We continue to grow. And at some point, and this is sort of a move into, to some degree, post-modernity, where we become very interested in psychology and the interior world and that sort of thing. And then Integral itself is where we realize that I'm growing, I'm being lived by something. I'm also living myself. I mean, I'm in charge, but there's something that's growing me. Mm-hmm. And then if I see that, and I see that it happens in these various ways, then I can start participating in that. I can become a conscious evolutionary, if you will.
Right. Versus
that itself is a stage of development.
Completely. It's like that, to me, that's the master lever, actually. Because, and I was going to ask you this, I'm glad you just sort of brought this up, where it seems to me that people go to college age people-ish, and adolescence, I think now is extending into the 30s, and some people say it to at least 25. And I'm curious in terms of, there's the brain development where we know that the brain really stops developing in the same way that it was before, in the mid-20s. And it's so interesting to me that people like find a job after college and then they kind of like park their car there and then they just hit, it's like a snooze button where they stop developing. Yeah. Now they might grow, and they might grow gray hair on their face, and they might get more ear hair or whatever as men do. But their interior isn't growing much. That's really curious to me. And then there's another piece I want to add, and I'd love to get your thoughts, which is some people don't see that I'm being grown, like you said. I love that. I've never heard that. It's really beautiful. I'm being grown, and wow, I want to participate in this experience. And they're sort of become maybe a victim of their environment, and they don't grow, and they don't want to grow, and they don't take any responsibility for growing. So I'm just curious about that and what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Developmentalists have noticed that, yes, we do develop, infants into childhood and adolescence and to adulthood. And then there is a long plateau of not much development, stage development, this vertical development that we're talking until old age. And then at old age, if you make it, there's another spurt of growth that comes from, letting go and all of the stuff, all the, the goodies that come with old age.
Yeah.
But yes, there is that long plateau of adulthood that is kind of, I think there's certainly a strata of consciousness where people want to break out of that, and And I also would say that sometimes it's just hard to know what's going on with people too.
For
It
sure.
looks like a plateau, but is it really a plateau?
Yeah.
Is there something that is deepening? Is there something that's, just in the background that is making one ready for a new growth spurt? But again, as we become conscious that emergence is built in, it's built into the cosmos.
Completely.
And we're expressions of it. When you realize that, then, you can wake up at any stage or any age and just be more intentional about, what's next for me, what's drawing me, what's repelling me, and this know thyself, this self-inquiry, this inquiry about the culture, about our families, about other people, curiosity, love, then the emergence takes care of itself in a way.
Yeah. Let's zoom out for a minute and talk about culture in terms of what's going on right now out in the world from an integral perspective. It seems like we have stages of development in large groups of people called culture, fighting and disagreeing. And could you speak to how that works from your vantage point in terms of, we could say far right, far left is one way to talk about the conversation.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that fighting is built into this emergence process. It's from
conflict's just part of the game.
It's absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, that's one of the great theses of your book, is that conflict is, it's not optional, and it's actually a gift. And if you approach it right, but of course we don't, and we haven't in history. And but we do fight our way forward. We also friend our way forward. We also, the other F word, our way forward. It's just, we just can't help ourselves. We just do that. So what we have, if we look at the culture and the culture war in the US, so we have 3 stages of development that are currently online.
Okay.
We have the traditionalists, and these are the God and country people. And, they're the social conservatives. They tend to be rural. These are the people I came from back in Western Pennsylvania. So then we have the modern people, and modern people are, tend to be secular. Maybe you keep your religion in terms of, but it's not so deeply held anymore. You're working in the modern world. You want to just keep the trains running on time. You want to do your job. You want to have a family. You want to, just live kind of a regular life. It's not nearly as ideological. And then there's the postmodern and postmodern progressives. That's a postmodern worldview. Every worldview pushes off of the previous one and kind of demonizes the previous one. And so postmodern becomes sort of anti-modern, anti-capitalist, world-centric, very interested in interiors, sensitive. It's often called the sensitive self. And this is the self that wants to right the wrongs of history and bring into the circle of moral consideration all of the people who have been left out. They tend to be environmentalists because they're world-centric, not just nation-centric, not just community-centric. So those are the 3 stages that are currently online. And we have the extremes. We have the MAGA on the one side, MAGA on the one side, and we have the woke on the other side. And those are the extremes of both of those, bookend worldviews. And currently, we're fighting our way forward. We're also friending our way forward. That there's a lot of that going on. It doesn't get the news and it doesn't get our attention as much, but we are. There's always here's the sort of problem with this evolutionary view, is that we say that evolution is creating a world that is more good, true, and beautiful. And it is. I mean, if you look at the world now versus earlier stages. What we're talking about with integral is we want to integrate the best of all of these stages into a sort of a bigger space where they all get to exist. And we see the upsides and downsides of all of them. It's like looking at the whole valley from higher ground, where you can see that there's the progressives, there's the modernists, there's the traditionalists, and look at them go, you know, and see that they all have something to offer, and they also have something that's really bad. You know, they have some disaster.
It's like a big shadow kind of side.
Yeah, a big shadow, exactly. And so that's what's going on right now. And I don't know where we could take a closer look at it, but that's the field of evolutionary emergence right now. And part of, I think, having an integral view is seeing that it's almost like your idea of conflict in your book. It's like we're supposed to be fighting. The good news is, for the most part, in the developed world at least, we're not fighting with clubs and knives and tanks like they are in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
But and that's also evolutionary. We're moving into fighting now in terms of ideas and worldviews rather than physical violence. There's some at the edges, but it's remarkably peaceful.
Yeah, and so you're taking this view here that evolutionarily we are in a much better place than 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago.
Yeah,
right? And our evidence we could look at just how we treat each other, right? Like 50,000 years ago, we might have been clubbing each other to death.
Yeah.
And we don't do that, right? We can cooperate at massive levels now in a way we couldn't before.
Yeah.
And the technology and the advances there, we could say, when we're in maybe an optimistic frame, like you're saying, or we have a positive bent on evolution, because a lot of people would say we're sort of devolving and we're just going to destroy the earth and we're going to, get on some rockets and hopefully recolonize on Mars or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And I don't rule anything out. That's for sure. Yeah. But yeah, it's tricky to talk about growth and things getting better. It's like a child. Is it better to be a 12-year-old than a 3-year-old?
Right.
Well, in some ways, but in some ways not. Is it better to be a 16-year-old? Well, in some ways, so we go forward and we see that at every stage we lose something. So we lose that magic spontaneity of early childhood.
Yeah.
And, where the world is alive and sparkling. And that's true also of early stages of humanity. The world was alive. I mean, literally with spirits everywhere.
Yeah.
And ancestors were still there, and we had this deep community with each other. And we, this is the downside of evolution. We had to leave home. We had to leave that behind. And then we move into this next stage, which is more complex. We get more calories, we get more security, we get more of something that is built in that we want. We get more connection, we get more powerful. And we move into the next stage where, was it better to have agriculture and, these empire wars and Rome?
Right. It kind of depends on the vantage point, right? If you're a farmer, then of course it's better. But if you're, or at least early on, now maybe not as much, but because it's like, whoa, look at all the food I can make, and now I can actually sell it and make money, and I can control people, and and from one frame, that's better, right?
Yeah, from the frame of evolution, it's better. That's what evolution wanted, and so we had to leave something behind. And it's like, is it progress to move from a bright-eyed 10-year-old to a surly 14-year-old? No. I mean, yes. It's like it
depends, right?
Welcome to growth.
Yeah.
It's a mixed bag. But here, if I could jump ahead, one of the great things about integral is the idea of integrating these previous stages.
Transcend and include.
In the culture, transcend and include. So at integral, we want to go back and we want to find what was good about these earlier stages And, one of them is magic.
Yeah.
And being in the wilderness and having a pre-modern mind and not knowing that canyon was created by evolution and not knowing anything about the barometer or just being there. Oh my God. Being in the wilderness, it's like everything is speaking to you. Everything is alive. And so we work on that. That's part of integral practice is, bringing that forward. And then we move into that next stage, which is the mythic stage, where we have a transcended God. It's no longer spirits. It's a transcended God in the universe, or nirvana. It's some way of escaping this hell of life.
Yeah.
That's, and so that we want to be obedient to that. And the world divides. It feels like devolution in a way, but it's not.
Yeah.
We get into good and evil.
Well,
and we want to be on the side of good, and we want to be obedient, and we want our life to matter because we're children of Almighty God, and blah blah blah. And that actually, we want to get rid of all the mythological, totalitarianism of it. But from an integral perspective, we do want to see that we have to be obedient, and there is something we want to submit to, and there is right and wrong.
Have you ever thought of going on a relationship journey, kind of like a hero's journey, to become who you are? Have you noticed how intimate relationships push us to bring our truest selves out in the open? Well, if you want to go on a journey, our signature course, Relationship Mastery, formerly known as Deeper, is enrolling, and I want you to come check it out, okay? Here is what one of our past BIPOC scholarship recipients, Andrea, said about her experience.
The program to me, it's just like, it's real. Sometimes you see programs like, oh, we're going to give you this and you're just going to fix it. No, this is like real life, which I can totally relate to. I mean, even the instructors are just super transparent, and that's like, they don't act like they're perfect. It's just like, hey, we all learning here, and that I can appreciate. It's well worth it. I actually had talked to someone about it today. She's like, what would you change about it? I was like, man, nothing really. It's such a different experience because it's real and it's actionable things that you can actually do. It's like they give you the tools, and it's like, it's so well worth it. I was like, yo, everybody needs to take this course. I feel like every human being needs this course. Like, this is what should have been in the school. Yes, math is great, science is great, but this right here, this is what you need as a human being to survive and interact and relate to people.
All right. Andrea had an amazing experience. 9 months later, she was a changed human being, eventually got married, wrote us this incredible testimonial, and her favorite quote was, "This shit is deep." And we had a laugh about that throughout the entire training. So, Andrea, thanks again. If you want to come join us, go to relationshipschool.com/relationship mastery or mastery. I love this concept of transcend and include that I first, heard from Ken's book, No Boundary, when I was in graduate school in Europa 20 years ago. And there's something powerful about that. And I just want to, for the listener, I want to bring this down to the street level of the human, back to the individual for a minute. Like when I started to differentiate from my parents and go to therapy, and I was looking at myself intently, I couldn't transcend and include. I had to reject. I went through a stage, right, where I rejected my parents and rejected everything they taught me. And adolescence, you could say, is like that as well. And then it took me some, inner work to finally realize, no, like my parents are awesome. And I'm so grateful for how they raised me and what I went through. And, we had this huge healing process because I had basically hurt them. And that's what happens in a growth journey. It seems like people who get on the personal growth path, for example, they don't transcend and include. There's like a stage where they are like, fuck that. I'm so glad I'm not that. Fuck all my old friends. Everybody's dumb and ignorant, and I'm the awake person here. And some people can stay stuck in that for a long time, but if we're still growing, we grow out of that. And I think that's why I love this transcend and include frame, because it's like, no, we're not rejecting the past. We're including especially the stuff that's good and helped us and is beneficial, right?
Yeah, right on. And if you look at history, again, culturally, you can see that, so we have the magic world. And then we have the mythic world, which is where these religions come online. And they spent a lot of time stamping out the magic and burning the witches,
right,
and melting down the golden calves, And so that they're very busy with that. And then we have the scientific world. And what does the scientific world do? It kills God, it very effectively, actually, and sets humanity into this anxiety of the meaning crisis, if you will. There's no meaning crisis at traditionalism. You're here to serve God.
Yeah.
And so then you have postmodernity, where we become nauseated by the materialism and the capitalist monetizing of everything and the ravaging of the natural world. That becomes each stage we move forward because we just get fed up with the previous stage. And totally. And for integral, there's a lot of people who are like, enough with you progressives. Enough sitting in a circle, and enough, sensitivity and victimization. And so that's where a lot of people in the most progressive culture is, actually. And
totally.
If you recognize that, you can see, okay, I'm having a right on schedule allergy to this previous stage. I can see it in myself,
Yeah.
And then you normalize it, and it's not like you've done something wrong.
Do we tend to polarize before going to the next stage? Is that sort of a common evolutionary principle here?
Yeah, this is a real standard philosophical principle of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So, or one of the ways Ken Wilber talks about it is we differentiate and then we integrate.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the culture as a whole, right now we're in a big differentiation process. It's called polarization. But what's also actually happening, if you look at the culture, is that traditionalism is getting more clear on who they are, as is progressives. They're both actually, all these stages, they don't just come online and then the next one comes online. They all continue to grow. They all and so we're getting a clarity. We had a sort of I don't want to say a false consensus, because it was the consensus of the time, but in 80s and 90s we had it was less of a polarization. Although I have to say, if I look back on all the newspapers I've read since I was 15 years old, there was always a lot of conflict on the front page. And if you lived through the 60s and 70s, good Lord, when progressivism came online with the hippies and, all of that, that was, and it also very violent, it was leftist violence then. But, so these stages, there's something that's pulling us, or something that's we're just sick to death of the stage we're at. And there's something that we see that's new and wants to come online.
Yeah, and it will emerge.
It's a story of humanity.
Yeah, so
it will emerge.
It's just going to happen. There's no sort of way around it, right?
Yeah, and there's post-integral stages too. I mean, we don't necessarily know what they are, but is evolution going to stop at integral? I don't know. I think maybe at some point we'll be walking through walls. I don't know.
Right, we don't know.
I don't rule it out.
Yeah, these three. Did you call these three things, traditionalist, modern, and postmodern, stages?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a nuanced question here. Does that mean that traditionalists are at a lower stage of development than a postmodern person?
Yeah, but it's
because it's I know it's hierarchical in a way. It's a spiral sort of going upward, right, in consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is where it becomes slippery, right? For a postmodern person to basically say, I'm more conscious than you. And that's sort of woke. It's so interesting that that's the new term, right? I'm more awake than you. You're more asleep than me.
Yeah.
It's they're naming
we
it,
awakened
right?
In traditionalism. In what would we do in modernity? I'm forgetting the term, but at any rate, every stage sees itself as a great new awakening, the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Modernity, where we left all of the, religion behind. But every stage has that feeling. But here's the other thing, is that every stage, this is where levels and lines really help. because there are a lot of people who are, they're progressives, but they're actually coming at it from good and evil. Their self-sense is still operating at that traditional stage.
They haven't developed the self-sense to expand into a bigger range and curiosity, right? They're into I'm right, you're wrong.
Exactly.
Morality.
So, but they still have a progressive view. So in some ways, they have a cognition that sees the climate. They see, karmas of history where people have been oppressed, and there's a worldview that traditionalists don't have.
Mm-hmm.
My family growing up, they didn't think about what was going on in other parts of the world, except when we would have a fundraiser by the missionary who would come by so that they could go convert them to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
That's
right.
So that is an earlier stage in the sense that it's what we're actually able to see and take into consideration. So that gets ever bigger from tribal on through.
Yeah. And so then we get into the question about power. Why would traditionalists in some time periods have more power than a postmodern person who is essentially, we could say, more evolved? Like, that's another interesting, and that comes back to lines and levels, I'm guessing, yeah?
Yeah, well, of course, historically, traditionalism existed when modernity and postmodernity didn't exist. They just weren't here yet. There might have been some people who were spiking. In Greece, they spiked into modernity, but that was in one line, philosophically, mathematically. Right. They still owned slaves. They were still warmongers, And then so the whole center of gravity has to continue to move up before we would say that that's a center of gravity in modern country, or a center of gravity postmodern country. And there really isn't any center of gravity postmodern country. Now, you could talk about Scandinavia, perhaps, but they're actually in some ways moving into integral because they're, incorporating capitalist principles, and to the degree that they become ever more friendly to traditionalists. That's one of the things this is when you're truly in postmodernity, where you really do want to include all of the people who have been left out, but you also want to include the people who don't believe in diversity.
Totally. You want to include everybody.
That's the integral move, is that you want a diversity that actually includes conservatives.
Yeah,
it doesn't
it's interesting.
Expect them to change, actually.
Totally. It's so interesting, right? The polarity between inclusivity and exclusivity. And if I'm saying we want to be more inclusive, it's just so interesting. But the person I'm going to exclude is the person that doesn't see it the way I see it.
Exactly. Totally. Yes.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah, it is.
Is this one of the big kind of blind spots of the postmodern person, would you say?
Yes. It's the blind spot of every stage. Modernists think that everything can be reduced to material, that there is no soul, that there's no, spirit, that, we're just protoplasm. That's
we're just
floating around, soaring through space in this rock with no meaning. That's a very, very, that's an impermeable worldview for a lot of people.
Completely.
And if you have religion or any kind of spiritual, you're either a woo-woo, new ager, or you're a wacko fundamentalist.
Right.
So every stage, of course, go get into the traditionalists, they think that their religion is the only right one.
Yeah.
They don't see the sexual revolution as being progress. That's just, they want family. They want home and hearth. That's the world that they want to live in. And so every stage, and of course, postmodernity as well, where this progressive worldview is the only right worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can believe that, and to the degree that you believe it in a good and evil way, you're actually, in terms of your emotional and sort of self-sense, you have a postmodern cognition with the traditional, or even earlier, sometimes a red, or what we would call the warrior, where you want to be violent. That's traditionalism. One of the things that in the magic worldview is very violent culturally.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who actually believe postmodern ideology from that place. We see them all the time.
Yeah, completely.
Wow.
So what is the way forward for us? And this is a relationship podcast, so of course the people listening are interested in a relational position, and probably a lot of people could self-identify as more in the postmodern camp, because postmodernism is kind of more relational in a certain way, more inclusive. But I see where you're kind of outlining some of the downsides here, and I'm just curious, what's the right move in terms of how you're meeting the world and how you advise others to meet the moment, because it's intense out there.
Yeah, it's intense. Yeah. First of all, there's 2 points I want to make here. One is, hang on here. What was the first question? What we do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So there's 2 things I want to say here. One is regarding the intensity. There's never been any stage of development that hasn't, for the people experiencing it, felt like a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So crisis is built into this evolutionary move, the whole evolutionary movement. So that's one thing, is to normalize this sense of emergency and crisis and realize, welcome to being human.
Yep.
Welcome to being in this, cosmos, this emerging cosmos. There's always, the next thing is unknown. It's scary, and we don't feel adequate to it. And so that's just built in. So I just want to normalize that a little bit. And then the second thing is we're moving into this postmodern worldview. So this integral worldview where we seek to be friendly, the universal donor to all of these previous stages is to do just that. And I see it happening like on Twitter. I've even seen it in the last year, and more, where people are wanting to be curious about their previous enemies, and they're bored with their own ideology.
Yeah.
And they want to integrate. They want to reach out beyond. And, part of it is, this culture war. And, there are people who really are moving into this next stage. And I think that's what we do. And the integral practice is to, first of all, change critical to curious about other people and other
that's huge. That alone could change everything.
Yeah, and that's pretty much it, actually. So, you go back to the family Thanksgiving, and you become curious about these people who are saying these things, and to see, what are they actually fighting for? And maybe they're fighting for home and hearth. Maybe they're fighting to not have their identities homogenized into this modern blender. Maybe they actually want to keep their sense of ancestry and their culture. And maybe there's something about that. Maybe we ought to be glad, that people take that seriously. And also, they live in an enchanted world. I mean, their world is lit up by God. And you want to disenchant their world? Good luck.
Yeah.
So, you begin to see that, your old aunts and uncles, they actually have something that we want to bring forward that modernity did not value.
Yeah.
And postmodernity found it embarrassing and parodied it, if you look at, and this is, if you want to just also parse the culture a little bit more, our culture is postmodern, and our institutions right now are pretty much modern. So the Republicans control the institutions, the Democrats control the culture. And that's sort of an interesting way of looking at things too. But that's the nature of, evolution. Cultures evolve in different lines. In every culture, this is the other thing this is where the cultural essentialists get it right, which is to say that every culture is completely unique, It's like every person, completely unique. There's no two alike. But yet we can also see that there's something about being a 3-year-old. There's something about being a 7-year-old. There's something about being an 18-year-old. And that there are these big moves that cultures make, each of them being their own unique selves. And we want those unique selves. We want the integrated world is not going to be, homogenized. It's going to be where
Right.
Russianness matters, Ukrainianness matters, Chinese, all of it will be, in the meantime, it's particularly, looking at this war in Ukraine, it's so discouraging.
Yeah.
But here we have a pre-modern worldview, this idea of imperialism, of my way's the right way, of and even that earlier stage, that empire stage, where you just grab as much territory as you can. I mean, if you're not being responsible, at that stage. So, welcome to this evolving world.
Did you read Ray Dalio's new book? Have you checked that out?
No, I haven't, but I'm aware of it and I intend to.
Yeah, it's really interesting, just in terms of the world order changing pretty soon and the conflict the crisis and the conflict that's necessary before power changes hands.
Yeah.
And you could say before there's a developmental leap forward in something.
Exactly. Well, in wars are, this is, again, evolution is beautiful, but not pretty, and we talk about moving towards goodness, truth, and beauty, but we often do that by means of their opposites, by badness and lies and, ugliness.
Corruption and power.
Yes, exactly. But if you look at the history of humanity, wars have been ultimately very fruitful. And if you look at World War II, think of Imperial Germany and Imperial Japan before World War II, and then Germany and Japan now.
Evolution.
Exactly. Two of the most evolved, peaceful, sophisticated countries on the planet. And
isn't that so interesting? Like, if people can just remember that's a great example.
Yeah.
Because it's so, I mean, you could say everybody's anti-war when it's happening, right? But 30 years later, 50 years later, looking back, we're like, wow, that actually helped us move forward here.
Yeah, exactly. And we can see another evolutionary move. And again, if we could look at kids, when kids have conflict, they hit each other, and then maybe they do sports and it's more organized and whatever. But at some point, we get to the point where we start wanting to, maybe we become lazy adults. We don't want to bother with all that anymore, but that's evolutionarily what happens. And we start arguing worldviews and ideas and politics and that sort of thing. And that's happening in culture too, is that, what are the chances that Germany is going to declare a war on France? Pretty much vanishingly zero.
Yeah.
But they were at war for their entire history. If you look at the boundaries of Germany and France over the 1,000-year history, it would be like a plate of worms. I mean, in every movement of the boundary was some hideous conflict. But so now we're still at war, but it's culture war instead of hot war in the West. And that we can take some comfort in because, if there was a no war option, I'd say, let's take that. But unfortunately, in this cosmos, evolution depends on it. And so we want our conflicts to be ever more sophisticated and ever more fruitful and peaceful. It's like what you talk about in your book.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Wow. Well, winding down, this has been amazing. There's a lot more I could get into here. I love this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
Jeff, so a couple more questions. One is, I don't know why I'm going to ask you this, but I want to, because I've never asked anyone this. Do you have a particular history book or podcast or person that is looking at history from this type of framework that you would recommend?
Yeah. I'm on the board of directors of an organization called the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And they're based here in Boulder. It's Steve McIntosh is the writer. And he just wrote a book called Developmental Politics that I would encourage anybody to read. Of course, I would recommend Ken Wilber's book, either A Brief History of Everything or Sex Ecology and Spirituality, sort of the big opus. Might be a bit much for some people, but the Brief History of Everything is very accessible. Yeah, but I have to go on.
Just a quick question on that Brief History. How would you compare that to a reader who's read *Sapiens*, for example?
Well, it's a very good question. And I was just going to say this, and that is that you don't find the evolutionary view very prominent in the intelligentsia. You just don't. Academia is completely against it. The postmodernity, one of its jobs is to deconstruct any hierarchies and triumphalist narratives of history. Mm-hmm. And that's where, most intellectuals are. So Yuval Harari, *Sapiens*, good book, but very materialistic. There's no soul of emergence or evolution that he would acknowledge. Same with Francis Fukuyama's new book. David Brooks, Anne Applebaum, Sam Harris. I love a lot of these people, but they don't have a developmental or evolutionary view. And for a lot of them, anything that is, what they would call supernatural is verboten. And that, of course, that's a necessary state.
Yeah.
But there's a new emergence that says, wait a second, I don't want to live in a disenchanted world. I want a re-enchanted world. Mm-hmm. I want to actually feel this. What is it that's made subatomic particles turn into us? There's a religion in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And the intelligentsia isn't there yet.
Yeah. When you say intelligentsia for the listener, what do you mean by that?
I'm talking about Yuval Harari, the commentators on the cultural commentators, and also
who aren't including this evolutionary kind of emerging field.
Right.
Got it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they're okay.
And there's no felt sense of emergence. Mm-hmm. That because again, it's like, so whose idea was emergence, and what's the purpose of the universe and the intention of the universe? These are all questions that they don't even acknowledge. Yeah, don't even acknowledge them. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for acknowledging them. It's so important, I think.
Yeah.
It's just
and I don't have great answers for them, but it's just there's something.
Yeah.
I can. There's realization, capital R realization. It's at some point you take a nice dose of mushrooms and you'll see the enchanted world.
You will see it.
You can't unsee it when you get back.
Yeah, it's forever altered. Yeah, that was my psychedelic trip in my 20s. My first, it just cracked my mind wide open. I was like, oh my God, okay, I can't deny that ever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it's helpful.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, this has been really rich. Jeff, 2 more questions. Where do people find you?
You can find me at dailyevolver.com. I have a YouTube page. I'm on Twitter. All Daily Evolver is the brand, if you will.
Yeah, and I would really recommend Jeff's Daily Evolver podcast. There's if you're liking what's happening here, there's a lot of really fun, nerdy conversations about the world. It's really cool. Yeah. Thanks for putting it out there like you do. Last question. Yeah. Last question is I ask all my guests. One of our missions here at the Relationship School is to reach young people with relationship education. And if I had a room full of 1,000 high schoolers, let's say, and I could only share one thing with them about relationships or love, and you were whispering in my ear, what would you want me to tell them?
Well, I would tell them to, do a real simple move, and it's real easy to remember. Turn critical to curious. We talked about that. Yeah. And if I had a room full of high schoolers, I would very much work on the conversation between traditionalism and postmodernity, and to make that a conversation that can be had, because now neither side is very eager to have it. They're still differentiating, fair enough, but there's an integration, and it can happen early. I love that you asked this question of all of your people, because if you look at the stage of development of high school kids now or young adults now versus when I was in high school or a young adult, I mean, my God, the evolutionary change is enormous. And who knows? The other thing is these kids are going to live to be 120 or 140, or God only knows how long they're going to. So evolution accelerates, and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be as different from us as we are from our grandparents and great-grandparents. And only more so, actually, because it's moving so much faster. So I don't know what that's going to look like, but the quicker we can get them to include and embrace worldviews other than their indigenous one, the one that they were given, the better.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. And just to comment on the acceleration of evolution, if I hear a naysayer saying that, well, where's the evidence of that? Just look at technology, right? Just the technological revolution and just how fast things are going is just unbelievable what we're doing.
Yeah, it's true. And, another good little back pocket concept of integral is that we evolve in terms of first, second, and third person. So when you're talking about technology, you're talking about third person, the world of systems and its and machines and technology. Then there's the second person. We're evolving in terms of relationship. And we can see, our relationships versus our grandparents and great-grandparents' relationships.
Oh my God. Yeah.
I mean, the culture that we have versus the culture of, 50, 100 years ago, evolving. And this is we space. This is a second person is its own reality dimension. Yeah. And in first person, our own individual consciousness, my own Jeffness. And, at some point you realize that this Jeffness preceded this lifetime and will survive this lifetime, or at least that becomes plausible.
Yeah.
And that, again, changes that, moves us beyond this materialist trap that so many people are in.
Yeah. Thanks for that reminder. And in particular, the move from critical to curious. We could all benefit from that right there.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, thanks again. Great seeing you. Really appreciate what you're up to in the world, and we'll put all the data points on where to find you in the show notes.
Super. Thank you, Jason, for having me. Thank you for your good work, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
There you have it, Jeff Salzman, integral theory and nerding out on culture, society, where we're at. Action step here is, how do you relate to this kind of conversation? Are you able to hold and zoom out a polarity of dark and light, or Democrat, Republican, left, right? Can you do that in your awareness? If so, it's a really good sign to me of your development and your health. I think it's really powerful, especially for you therapists and coaches, to be able to listen to people that are different from you and watch two sides argue. That's why I love working with couples, is because I'm the space holder, right? Holding a bigger possibility for them. And any good couple knows that warring, fighting over right and wrong, doesn't do anything to get the couple forward in their life. So I think it's kind of fun to zoom in on the individual here and then go collective with this type of conversation. I think it's really useful for me as an exercise. Let me know what you think. Always leave us a comment, a review, social media, a share, a follow. Please definitely subscribe to this podcast. If you haven't left a review, please do, if it's meaningful to you. Thanks again for being an awesome listener and a human who cares. As you know, I've dedicated my life to helping people with their relationships, right? I want to solve this problem so that all of you can work through your differences and have fulfilling, amazing, badass partnerships and relationships, family, coworkers, friends, whoever. And I have trained a ton of relationship coaches, almost 100 certified relationship coaches, to help you specifically work through your relationship challenges. So I want to invite you to a special deal we're offering to the podcast listener, where you can get 50% off your first month of coaching with one of our amazing relationship coaches. Okay, if you're tired of therapy, it feels like that's going around in a circle, or you want to actually set goals and accomplish your relationship goals, hire a relationship coach. Okay, go to relationshipschool.com/get coaching now, and then use the coupon code FIRST50 to get the 50% deal off your first month of relationship coaching. Super psyched to have our amazing coaches serve you and help you get to the next level. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Share one of these videos with a friend. We want to help the planet get their act together around relationships, and you are one of them, so thank you.